Right, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to our first plenary session today, and this is titled The Data Behind Creating a World-Class Healthy City Through Living Infrastructure. Urban areas are both sustainable and drive innovation within economies. To do this, they must attract the best talent and give them the quality of life to engage and be creative. There is a renewed focus on how offices and cities can continue to attract workers. And this talk will look at how the role of urban design plays in reflecting the new aims, equitability, climate adaptability, and health. Like many disciplines, urban planning is going through a revolution in the way that it uses data and analysis. This talk will explore some of the data we can assemble and how this can be used by designers to produce human spaces. To do this, the Urban Affairs Group has brought together a scientist and an urbanist who will give an overview of what needs to be done for the city and how we can do this. I am delighted to introduce David Illingsworth from the London Structures Lab as your chairman for this plenary and to set the scene and introduce his panel. David, if you'd like to come up, I'm going to say over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. I'm David Illingworth, from co-founder of London Structures Lab, and I'm introducing our next speakers on behalf of the BCO Urban Affairs Group. The Urban Affairs Group is a little bit of an outlier here, looking primarily at good practice in urban design and how offices can be catalysts for urban regeneration. I'm even more of an outlier, being a structural engineer, looking at a very civil issue. But cities are the dominant habitats in the UK. 90% of us live in one, and they've been on a steady progression around the world. This hasn't always been planned or conscious move, with most cities having numerous critical moments as they creak under the strains of their various infrastructure components. In addition, people have taken for granted certain aspects and have focused on the negatives, such as crime per capita and currently disease. As a result, they often talk about urban flight, which rarely happens, with London needing the compound impacts of post-war Britain to check its constant growth. Declining industries and war can have impacts, but even our most destructive inventions do not kill cities. Historically, some have died, and the root cause is almost always linked to climate change. While cities and their outputs no doubt cause climate change, they themselves are very sustainable, or can be. Scale, by Geoffrey West, highlights that as we double the size of cities, we less than double the energy we use and the infrastructure we need. We also more than double the economic and cultural outputs, as well as the number of highly innovative people. So we need cities and people to be attracted to live and work there. The Urban Affairs Group is interested in all these things, but being part of an organisation focused on the best practice of the workplace, we're also interested in how an urban fabric can directly influence individual and organisations' health, productivity and creativity. We know that well-developed, maintained and even curated places can attract companies and staff. There are various numbers that can be looked at for building a convincing argument. But what makes a healthy place and one where the people are able to be more productive? This is not just in the area in the immediate vicinity, but the full journey from door to door. A safe journey of a variety of modes at whatever time we wish to work. Will reduce the stress on the wide section of society, meaning a more diverse and productive employee walks through the door. This talk will show how to make the journey and environment within which we place our workspaces irresistible to employees and their organisations. Cities are about knowledge sharing and innovation. Culture emanates and attracts, but why settle for that? Why not make them a truly enjoyable place to be and travel around? To explore this subject, we have brought together the scientist and urbanist. Josh Atrus, an urban and business strategist at Centric Lab, where they use neuroscience and data to help organisations create healthy and resilient environments. as well as Michael Cowdy, who is urbanism lead at McGregor Coxall, a groundbreaking urbanism and landscape architecture and environmental design firm, where he has led the design of healthy, smart, sustainable and vibrant places and cities. Josh has been unable to make it today, so the first part of his contribution will be via video, which I'll introduce now.
COVID was the Overton window for change, and hopefully it's not too late. And whilst many office owners and asset owners were fearing dwindling demand and asset values, quite frankly, people were seeing a quality of life to work balance that many really didn't want to lose. And this is because going back to normal didn't work for many people. They were getting tired of the urban madness and the boredom at work, and going back to normal brought with it the workplace productivity problem of burnout, stress and illness. The burnout pandemic has been going on for years and is the problem to solve going forward, especially as we know that 90% of overheads are on workplace talent. And beyond the issues of workplace productivity, we've also been dealing with a wider economic issue where a person with a chronic illness is more likely to develop another and drop out of full-time work entirely. A lot of this is down to the fact that our cities are full of stressors. Air pollution, noise pollution, light pollution, heat pollution are all forcing our bodies to work overtime to balance out, causing biological disruption and at worst, dysregulation. And the science behind this is because our bodies are in constant communication with our surroundings through various biological systems. One of these key systems is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates through various hormonal responses. It allows our bodies to detect and adapt to acute stresses such as pollutants found in our urban areas and workplaces. And when we're constantly exposed to stresses such as pollutants, our bodies struggle to adapt, causing a constant engagement of the HPA axis, which can lead to a dysregulation of our biological systems. This dysregulation is the link between health and place. As our bodies go through these processes, we don't operate as effectively as we should. The urbanized environment is adding a stress to our bodies and thus brains. And stress plays a key role in cognitive function. It can deteriorate our brain and body systems, affecting areas of the brain like the hippocampus, and overall impacting our own immune system. So not only are urban environments providing us with stress, these type of environments are not providing us with the necessary solutions to the more social work stresses we experience in life. And it's been shown that natural environments help mitigate the impact of environmental stresses, offering physiological, emotional, and attentional restoration, especially when tested against urban environments. And this is all happening in the looming spectre of climate change, which is going to disrupt our natural environments, adding environmental stress to humans through adverse weather, and disrupting the natural microbiome of our habitats, which we depend on for our own microbiome health, our gut health, our own biology. And at the same time, the future of work is being driven by human skills, where leading institutions and consultancies are declaring that these human skills are going to be driving business forward. Yet these human skills are being impacted by our urban environments. So the solution around this, twofold. Number one, treat health as ecological. Understand there are various inputs working in tandem: habitat, culture, and intersectionality. Focusing on one issue alone will not be effective. The second is to clean and green our urban infrastructure as we prepare for climate change. As you can see from the picture chosen here, this is not how the Thames River looks or the Hackney canals. It's time for change. For example, sustained urban drainage systems are crucial as pollutants captured in stormwater runoff contribute to water contamination in nearby lakes and rivers. When rainwater is absorbed where it falls, plants, soils and microbes break down many common pollutants, leaving our surface water cleaner. Vegetation, drainage layers and soils retain water and reduce stormwater volumes. This keeps the rain out of our drains, combines sewers and sewer systems, and helps reduce pollution and floods. I urge everyone to read this fantastic report by the Urban Land Institute, produced with Hypothalamic Asset Management a few years ago, on the investment landscape and climate change. Quite frankly, this is no longer a nice to have climate resilience, it's a critical business resilience need. We are already experiencing it in UK and in London, and it's not going to get any easier or better going forward. So the methodology to start making decisions: be scientifically led, use the right type of data, understand urban footprints. The Biological Inequity Index brings together various environmental data sets on the factors that impact our biological health. Scoring developed through a scientific research and recently completed assessment of the UK with our new geoscience partner called CGG. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to introduce 3 areas from London just to give you an indication of what's going on. With the worst, the pocket of Marylebone, the mid-range, this pocket of Bermondsey in the middle, and the best, in parentheses, is over here in Bethnal Green, not too far from where we are right now. And the other part of the methodology is to be human, to understand people. This is a question from a project we've developed with PLP Labs and Camusi called Know Your Health. And I was once told by an advisor a long time ago that he said being a neuroscientist isn't about hooking people up to headsets. It's about learning what type of questions to ask. So incorporating environmental and health data, we can start to address whether an area supports the health and well-being of the people who use it frequently, and really ask this question: is this area healthy? The current data demonstrates urban planning and development failures. The purple spots you see on the screen are the failures, and we now have the data to demonstrate this. One company we've been doing this with is Lendlease, with the International Quarter, not too far from here, which we scored as actually one of the healthiest workplace districts in London. In fact, it is the healthiest workplace district we have scored, and we've been working with them to double down on the great opportunity they have in building a climate-resilient future workplace. Another organisation we've worked with is Grosvenor Americas, working with a development team to build an asset, amenity and activity solutions package that would lead to social impact in the local area and benefit the incoming people. Overall, the outputs of what we do: providing ecological health framework and toolkits. We help engage with other stakeholders and local authorities about plans for greening the cities, looking at investing in green infrastructure, which also creates jobs. Hello, ESG. And really, it focuses on developing an inclusive people-first strategy to elevate employee and worker health and the people connected to your buildings and places. And the outcomes is really focusing on the health and well-being improvements for 90% of a business's bottom line, doubling down on ESG impact, and really looking at asset and business resilience against the looming threat of climate change. So I'm going to end with, no, I'm not, he's a racist and colonialist. I'm going to end with a wonderful quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, an Indigenous woman from North America, from this book, Braiding Sweetgrass. Thank you for your time.
So following the music, I don't think Michael's brought any, but there's an urbanist response to that. Michael will be presenting here now. Now, Josh is going to be online, massively oversized, for questions at the end, so can you hold them till then? Michael.
Brilliant. Right, well, thanks everyone. This is the first event I think I've presented at in about 20 months. It's been webinars for the past 20 months, but nice to see faces. And I look forward to following on a bit of what Josh has talked about, which is about the importance of essentially creating a living infrastructure within our urban environments. So I've broken this down into kind of 4 chapters. They're not that long, but they kind of punctuate this session and kind of give you an emphasis of how we're considering the future of cities. Firstly, Biocity. This is a philosophy that the McGregor Coxall's been developing now for almost 2 decades. And then going to move into the living components to our cities, and that's looking at living infrastructure and what living infrastructure actually is. Adaptation, that's spatial adaptation, but it's also about climate adaptation. And then last is about the engaging futures. How can we start to look at technology and the future of our cities in a more engaging manner? So Biocity, well, the practice is kind of broad, structured around 4 components: urbanism, landscape architecture, environment, and biocity research. And it's today's topic I'm going to focus on primarily is our biocity research. Now, This studio emerged in 2006 in response to these challenges that cities are facing. And in response to those challenges cities are facing, we felt that we started to need to diversify how we looked at projects, bringing in science, technology, ultimately using that to inform design. The philosophy is brought down through, is established through a series of systems. And when we look at the operation of cities, these systems all have to work in balance to create a harmonious and healthy place for people to live and work in. There are two components. I guess we've got biosystems, which is the biotic aspect to life, and that's looking at citizens, food, landscape, waste, and water. And there are the urban systems, which are the abiotic aspects of non-living components to our cities, and that's economy, energy, mobility, technology, and infrastructure. And when we look at our cities and make sure there's a sustainable outcome, we need to ensure all these systems are all working in tandem to create a balanced outcome to society. Now, we've been looking at projects all around the world, and we've been looking at, obviously, establishing blue and green infrastructure frameworks within cities, enhancing a city's health. We've been looking at ensuring that we're considering sustainable prosperity for people across various parts of the world. And we've been also looking at ensuring that we reconnect communities and their nature together to ensure climate resilience isn't seen as just climate resilience, it's also climate resilience is intrinsically connected to social health and well-being. So how do we operate? Well, we consider the science, the technology as important attributes in informing design, and it all comes down to data. Just as Josh has highlighted, and just as the previous speaker talked about, data is a fundamental component in us ensuring an accurate and a responsive outcome to our design solutions. And we've been looking at cities for a number of years and looking at how cities are starting to distribute their kind of urban form. We're looking at population densities. And just this statistics here, you can start to see that a lot of the cities only appropriate 11% of public green space, 12.9% green space. So we're talking quite low figures when comparative to the urban world. London actually stands out 33%. And then you've got Singapore, which is the shining light of about 47% of green space. But we have a real challenge that we're not seeing this large, expansive use of open space in our cities. If we zoom in a bit further, we can start to see actually the dissection of how a city is typically made up of. You're looking at generally majority of cities are urbanized. That's through service vehicle routes, roads. It's through pedestrian footpaths with pockets of open space. Interestingly, these spaces are typically in different districts. So there's a kind of trend of inequality in open space. And we're also seeing pockets of these spaces in little islands sitting in these urban metropolises. So humans consider our cities to be separate from nature. And why is this? Why are we not seeing nature embedded in our urban environments? Well, it all comes down to going back to our past, and that's the Industrial Revolution and the mass urbanization and how society started to kind of migrate to cities. That mass migration started to kind of create economic growth, but it also created deprivation, a lack of health, poor living conditions. And those living conditions sparked a kind of transitional change in how cities were starting to be designed. And public open spaces became a fundamental component of how cities started to provide places for people to recover, a respite, deal with pandemics, and all the type of conditions that started to kind of really become apparent in a lot of developing cities. Interestingly as well, during this period in the 1920s, the public open space standard started to emerge. And that was about creating a per capita ratio of open space for 1,000 people. Now this, 100 years on, is still a basis in how we operate in designing our open spaces. Yes, there's some qualitative aspects, but fundamentally in 100 years, we still haven't changed how we allocate open space and how we consider open space. The other aspect is the dominance of grey infrastructure. As humans, we obviously see we can engineer solutions, which are fantastic, but equally we've kind of diverged ourselves from the use of nature. And grey infrastructure through roads, pit and pipes, drainage, wastewater treatment are ways of us kind of replacing nature's role and actually creating a human response. And these things combined have created some really large challenges facing cities. We're seeing projections of above 6 degrees temperature increase in our cities in just London itself. I've seen articles saying that London by 2050 will be like Barcelona and Milan. Urban heat island is a fundamental problem facing cities, and that's because of the large expanses of urban hard surfaces. This also translates to flooding. Flooding in cities is increasing across the world. It took me an hour and 20 minutes to get across just to this location today because half the tubes were closed because of flooding. This is going to be a common problem facing our cities, so resilience is a fundamental importance in improving that. We're seeing increases in obesity due to lack of access to quality open spaces, and we're seeing a mental health issue which is linked to a lack of connection to the natural environment, as Josh was highlighting before. So what's this kind of solution? Well, it's about starting to embrace a new paradigm shift in conceiving our urban environments. It's looking at living infrastructure. Now, what is living infrastructure? Well, many of you may have heard it referred to as blue and green infrastructure. Quite simply, the blue spaces, the rivers, the streams, the ways of managing flooding, and the green spaces, the parks, the gardens, the forests. Those are the two components that really fundamentally make up what living infrastructure is. And it's about essentially strategically planning, designing, and managing to deliver increased quality of public life in urban areas and rural settings through blue and green infrastructure. Now, there are 8 kind of, I guess, themes or aspects or typologies, you could say, of what living infrastructure comprises. Productive and performative landscapes, public squares and plazas, private and semi-private spaces, streets and laneways, public parks and gardens, greenways, blueways, sports and recreational facilities, green roofs and walls. Now, these are all aspects that are important in creating prosperity for people, but also improving productivity and performance in a city's environment. Now, as a practice, we've started to kind of use our research to start to dissect the attributes of what make living infrastructure. Historically, we've seen it as a kind of siloed aspect to how we see cities. Well, actually, we see it as an intrinsically integrated component to cities, and we need to start to consider it holistically, just like you would if you did a master plan. We've broke down these kind of aspects into social health and well-being, climate adaptation and resilience, sustainable and green economics, and smart governance and delivery. If we move to social health and well-being, well, firstly, it's important about encouraging close, easy access to active lifestyle choices, so that we're encouraging people to be fit and healthy. It's looking at improving our quality of public realm so that it facilitates cultural interaction, social interaction, so people can actually connect. It's about connected spaces, about how close and easy it is to access these spaces through active travel or walking, not having to go on kind of tubes or buses. It's about that close proximity. And it's about diverse typologies. Not everything has to be about scale and size. It's not about quantitative scale of public spaces. It's about the qualitative. And that can be in small pocket spaces all the way through to large district parks. Climate adaptation and resilience, well, we're really looking at urban greening, and this is how can our cities start to become more resilient. Increased tree canopy cover, looking at carbon sequestration, actually preserving land and looking at soil quality, water responsiveness, managing flooding in our urban environments, and living landscapes. That's encouraging ecologies and biodiversity to be part of our living environment. Sustainable green economics. You know, we're looking at cost efficiencies. Can we start to embed more living infrastructure which starts to reduce heat bills, water bills, and so forth? The proven opportunity of increasing living infrastructure is demonstrating huge increase in value of properties as well. We're looking at resource management in terms of actually we can make sure that we work with PVs and various renewable resources. And the circular economy. Waste shouldn't exist in a city environment. We should be able to recycle that waste and reuse it for the benefits. And you can see some of the figure here, £2.1 billion could be saved in health costs just if England had better access to green space. And the last is smart governance and delivery. You know, we're at a time now where technology is a real asset, and it's important that we start to use that technology, and it can start to inform better planning policy. We can start to encourage more collaborative partnerships, especially in councils where there can be cross-departmental collaborations. Funding mechanisms, again, can be cross-departmental, and the embeddedness of data in our kind of city environments to understand how places are performing and how we can ultimately improve them. So chapter 3 takes a bit more of a focus on the climate adaptation component. And the reason being is we have seen climate resilience and climate adaptation as almost a separate topic to social health. That's not correct. It's completely intrinsically connected to social health. If we get climate resilience right, we can start to improve the social health and performance of our cities. Now, the two areas of just focusing on there's the roofscape and the streetscape, two very simple spatial typologies that every city has. Why? Because around most cities, 70% of our cities are configured of just those two typologies. It varies in cities, it can be less, it can be more, but really about 3/4 of a city is made up of just those two typologies. So if we start to look at those typologies differently, we can make huge inroads into improving social health and climate resilience. Stephen Peck from the non-profit organisation Green Roofs for Healthy Cities described the roofscapes of our cities as the last urban frontier. Up to 15 to 35% of our roofscapes are untapped resources that can be utilised. A roof garden isn't a new thing. I know I'm not going to be talking about that as an innovation, because I know that people are all looking at that. But the reality is a lot of our roofs are underutilised, and there's figures such as 2% of our roofscapes in most cities are the ones that are utilised for these social environmental spaces. So, other kind of designers and architects have been saying how landscapes can be the kind of new verdant opportunity for cities to kind of create rooftops in the sky and opportunities for businesses to actually provide welcome space for their kind of workers to utilise. Now, around the world, cities are starting to embrace this approach, and roof gardens, green roofs, social landscapes in the roof, in the kind of skyline are obviously seen as now a realistic reality. But there are some interesting innovations in roofscapes, and again, some of you may already know this, but I think it's really important to start to see the potential. We're seeing in Denmark, a waste management energy centre become a ski slope, where there's actually rock climbing, there's actual kind of trails for people to use. So a typical power station that would be seen as a redundant resource from a social perspective is now a playground for a city. We're seeing community centres and well-being areas focused on roofs so that people can actually start to utilise these spaces, get vast views across cities. We're seeing cinemas and leisure and entertainment become a fundamental part of the city roofscape. We're seeing, obviously, biodiversity increase in kind of some radical architectural solutions that look at vertical forests. We're seeing urban farms and sheep actually start to become using the roof gardens themselves as well, increasing biodiversity, increasing food growth, and starting to contain actually our urban agriculture within the cityscape. And we're also having branding changes in how people start to see roof. We've got Rainbeer in Netherlands, which actually recycles and reuses water from obviously the heavens, and actually creates beer, which people are using, and that's a branding opportunity. So they're actually making monetary value out of their roof by branding it, and I'm sure you're all aware there's various beehives that can be located on roofs, and honey can be sold, and that can be branded again, part of that roof. So they're really interesting social, environmental, and economic opportunities that this space that is underutilised can be supporting. And some stats, you've got 70 to 90% roof reduced burden on sewer systems in summer through water capture of roofs, 100% reduced urban heating in summer through roofscapes if it's got urban greening measures. Reduced heating can be down to 40% in winter. You've got 1 metre squared of green roofs can help absorb 0.2 kilograms of airborne particles. 15% high level of well-being through office greening. So one of the interesting areas is internal office greening is seen through various statistics of improving the performance and productivity of their staff. You're seeing increased carbon sequestration from roofs. You're seeing annual rainfall can be massively retained and contained, like buckets in the sky that store the water. And you're seeing reduction in demand for air conditioning units as such as minus 75%, again, reducing costs, and a reduction in air temperatures through green walls. So these measures are obviously improving the climate performance of a city, but they're also improving the social performance and the economic costs. And let's move to the street. Probably one of the most untapped resources in our cities. It's predominantly known as a vehicle route at the moment, but it doesn't have to be that way. Historically, streets have always been part of society. They've been thoroughfares and movement patterns that brought social and economic interaction in places. Nowadays, they're probably more commonly known as roads, and they tend to kind of accommodate the majority of vehicles. But interestingly, roads in, for example, London form 80% of the public space. We just don't allow people necessarily to use them. We predominantly use them as cars. Now, this isn't new statistics. Everyone knows this. And obviously, the iconic, well-known Yangel has really put forward in the last 20 years this emphasis of first life, then space, then buildings. Not the other way around doesn't work. And really it was about how can we shift our cities and our urban spaces to become more socially friendly. And the success of this has obviously been translated into many cities around the world. Copenhagen, Melbourne, New York have all started to reduce their road infrastructure and kind of shift it to more social infrastructure and streets. But there's a missing ingredient that we're not noticing in a lot of these fantastic streets, and it's the fact that they're fundamentally missing the natural component to cities. So the new paradigm shift in how we conceive cities is about slotting in nature as part of life, because if we don't consider it that way, then we're going to be having some really challenging times ahead. Just a simple kind of GIF here highlights what a kind of urban and green infrastructure and living infrastructure can do to improve the environmental performance, making it more hospitable, inviting, friendly. You can see huge changes in temperature. You can start to encourage social spaces, more inviting areas for people to utilize, reducing road space, making it more connected. Again, a more inviting environment for people to visit and utilize. Now, innovations in streetscapes have kind of taken quite a broad stance here. I think we have to mention China. We heard about how it's kind of progressively looking at economics. Well, actually, it's hugely progressively looking at cities. They've adopted pretty much a nationwide approach called Spun Cities. And that's really looking at trying to achieve 80% of urban areas should at least absorb 70% of water on site and look at cleaning it. This is a real radical change. It's looking at streets, it's looking at roofs, it's looking at permeable materials, it's looking at all of the infrastructure being naturalized. You have Cloudburst, Copenhagen, and Green Grey in San Francisco, which are essentially trying to separate their drainage systems from their sewer systems through natural suds and essentially trying to hold and store that water so it doesn't start to flood through the natural grey infrastructure that's in cities. We're seeing water-sensitive Rotterdam, which is creating an interconnected network of water squares that when there is mass flood events, these squares can fill up and contain water and store it. We're seeing Canberra living infrastructure, which is about fundamentally embedding living infrastructure within policy so that all future developments have to consider living infrastructure as a prerequisite when delivering those schemes. And we have the successful delivery of Greater Green in Sheffield, which is again transformed very urbanized, hard road environments into natural sud streets, looking at kind of increased biodiversity and improving water collection and cleaning as well. But the other aspect, which is the most kind of simplest aspect in kind of looking at improving streets, is the tree canopy cover. Increasing the extent of urban canopy has become a popular goal for many cities who aim to mitigate the impacts of urbanization. Many cities now around the world are looking to increase tree canopy cover because they know that it's a fundamental tool to manage the impacts of climate change. You're seeing cities around the world currently sitting between the 30 and the kind of 15% marker in tree canopy cover. If you look at some cities, most cities now are looking to double that. And that doubling essentially is looking at 35% for Bristol. You're looking at 30% for London, and around Sydney is about 40%, all of which are looking to do this to mitigate and manage urban heat and also increase the carbon sequestration in their cities. Now, let's think, this trees, everyone knows what a tree is, but there are huge benefits of what planting a tree in the right location with the right soil makeup and the right species. Spending time near trees improves physical and mental health by increasing energy levels. It can increase the speed of recovery. You can start to produce food again, so you can start to look at urban agriculture. Having nature in a workspace enables better focus, mental stamina, and productivity. And one study found that employees with better views were likely to spend more time at their desks. If you look at the environmental benefits, you're looking at reduction of 2 to 8 degrees in urban heat. You're looking at excellent filters for urban pollutants and fine particulates. And you're looking at improved regulation of water flow, improved quality, and obviously that carbon sequestration is a fundamental part of its environmental offering. But there's an economic benefit as well. You're looking at 20% increase in property values. You're looking at reduced costs of air conditioning by 30%, and you're also looking at energy use for heating by 20 to 50% in buildings. So that's some of the stats just on kind of climate adaptation. The last bit I want to kind of take you on is the kind of the data. The data is a fundamental tool that we have in trying to resolve these challenges. If we look at cities, there's obviously been the touted word of the smart city. And I've kind of particularly focused on the smart sustainable city from the United for Smart Sustainable Cities, because I think it really sums up where we're trying to go. Data is a really excellent tool in informing and understanding how places are operating and how we can fundamentally use that data to inform better decision making to create better outcomes. If you look at the progression of data, we're seeing huge importance of geospatial techniques in cities, understanding how they're operating and working. We're seeing the emergence of digital twins, which allow us to start to simulate how cities can start to deal with these stresses, which are really important tools in managing the fluctuations in climate. We're seeing future cities such as NEOM, which is looking at creating a kind of intelligent system through redirecting travel underground and essentially creating a managed system that actually reuses everything on site. We're seeing Singapore, which is touted as the smart city of the world, start to create new districts such as Tengah, which again is looking at vehicle-free and essentially creating increased forestry within the city. And then you're seeing implemented in Zurich smart streetlights, which actually start to collect environmental data. They start to ensure we understand how the movement's being operating in those spaces, essentially allowing the city to understand what's working and what isn't. But there are challenges with this, and there's been many issues highlighted with the fact there's a lack of privacy with this smart data. It's also hugely expensive and it requires a huge investment. And the technology changes so quick that it can become out of date. So we can't really rely on just going through the smart technological response. We have to start to think of alternate methods. And that's really where I think we need to start looking at engaging cities, using people as our tools to actually assist us in understanding and informing these outcomes. We need to look beyond these tools and services in the smart city. Some cities have also begun to take a clearer stance on the values that should underpin the city and its use of data. And that's actually having an ethical perspective on where humans play in that. You've got public life tools by Gale Architects that has always been looking at on-site data. They've essentially on the ground understanding how places are operating, and they use that data to create better design decisions, and they then monitor those design decisions to see what works and what doesn't. You've got sensory data collection through Array of Things. This is actually an urban sensing project, but they actually engaged with all the neighborhood in all the technological aspects of it so that they understood what data could be extracted from this. And it was a transparent process that the communities are still involved in now. And you've got Deciding, which is looking at open source engagement, getting people to actually inform how cities can be operating in a better way. So what does this all lead to? Well, it ultimately leads to us looking at key performance indicators, or KPIs. And we need to start to establish, just like athletes do, a set of targets. We as cities or developers or site owners need to establish some clear KPIs to ensure that we're hitting those goals, which are completely interlinked with the data projections. And as a practice, we've been looking at KPIs on a number of schemes of Transport for London, projects in Sydney, looking at places in the Middle East, to actually provide a very clear, definitive narrative of where these cities should be going and what their targets should be. Now, if we just take away all this complexity of numbers and data and everything like that, the simple thing is, this quote here, which was by Shoshana Sachs, really highlights it. We could be talking about smart cities, but reality is there's an argument for just having dumb cities, and those dumb cities are fundamentally underpinned by the ability to use nature as its natural resource to manage all these challenges. It doesn't have to be just data. Nature can be that tool, and it's using those old ideas and building them into our city infrastructure that we could learn a lot and actually ultimately improve our social health performance and our climate resilience. Thank you.
Right, there's only one question so far on the Slido, and this is all very male and pale. Is the BCO losing touch with the real world? And I can't help but thinking that Josh wrote that. But I can only say, sorry, Rachel, who was supposed to lead this from us, was decided that I'd do it. So in the meantime, if there's no other questions, I've got one to try and get the ball rolling. The BCO, as an organisation that brings together the best of our industry in the UK, What would the one piece of research, is Josh able to come online? There he is. Hi, Josh. What is the, sorry, this is the first time you've seen him. This is Josh. What is the one piece of research that you would encourage us to do in order to understand our cities better and make them more productive?
I'll let Josh go first because I feel like nobody's seen him yet. So go on, Josh. Oh, okay.
There we go. Sorry. Fantastic. First of all, big third rock from the sun, big giant head thing going on here. Sorry, everyone. What would be the main opportunity for research? I'd say to reframe the investment potential that Section 106 Community Infrastructure Levy has as a way of building urban resilience for asset owners, to not think of it as a tax, but think of it as an investment opportunity that individual landowners and site owners and developers can collaborate on to understand the long-term resilience that could bring to a city like London in comparison to somewhere like Amsterdam, where many large creative firms are going, or even places like Dublin, where large technology companies are going. I say that is a great opportunity to explore with economists, ecologists, and hopefully health researchers like us.
Do you want me to go as well?
Yeah, go for it.
I guess the interesting thing is the way society's been kind of considering urban environments is obviously predominantly now looking at the social benefits, and I think it'd be really good for the BCO to start to investigate probably further what we've been talking about today, which is the kind of the ecological benefits our environment does in improving productivity. Because there is obviously data out there, and there is obviously research out there, but I think if the BCO as an organisation itself starts to look at that, then that could have a huge influence in how cities are starting to conceive these urban spaces. So I think that would be one particular area I'd look at.
Okay, so one from the Slido. Josh needs to explain his plant behind him.
Yeah, not my. I'm not in charge of the plants, unfortunately. It hasn't travelled well. The house is full of them, but unfortunately, that one is a replanting, so not doing so well.
Okay, so are there any policies other than the city of climate change? Are there any planning policies other than the City of London's urban greening factor which will encourage developers to add greening to their schemes? Or are there any that you'd like to see?
So I can kind of jump in here. We've been working with Transport for London on essentially developing up their sustainable development framework. And I think what that's starting to do is highlight that just having urban greening factor isn't enough. There needs to be far more established KPIs built into our kind of, planning process that it ensures we are achieving it. There's biodiversity net gain, there's rainwater collection, there's standards, but there's a whole tranche of other KPIs that we can start to be building in. And I think it's important as well to kind of, when we're looking at KPIs, it's not just climate, there's the social KPIs, there's economic KPIs. So I don't know if there's anyone from TfL here, because I know there's a big launch coming on soon, but the Sustainable Development Framework is essentially breaking down TfL's development sites into 9 dimensions. And those dimensions are kind of batched into thirds. So you've got your environmental, your social, and your economic components. So each of those, one of those 9 dimensions has got a series of KPIs that are going to be kind of, proposed, which are going to ensure that future development on their own land is being kind of legally bound in achieving these developed, very progressive KPIs. So it's a really interesting way in ensuring that there's a sustainable focus built into all development in the future. So I think that's a good example I've seen looking with public sector and the developer world. So that could be a way of expanding out urban greening factor far more so, because I don't think urban greening factors, well, it's not enough, to be honest. Josh?
Do you want to add anything further, Josh?
Perhaps just to complement, it's a slight narrative shift, and what I mean by that is there's a lot of development decisions that really get spoken about within the context of a red line and the immediate vicinity. But to stand up for people like the GLA, who do produce a lot of data about the resilience or lack of resilience, or how people like us identify health hotspots and health risk hotspots in cities, some of these aren't always located directly next to a large development. But what it will require are multiple landowners and stakeholders working together in these areas, contributing impactfully their Section 106 agreements, their community infrastructure levy. And whilst private landowners and developers don't have the control, there is an opportunity to be a more proactive force by trying to build better relationships, more constructive relationships with authorities. And so in sum, I'd say it's thinking beyond the red line by understanding where in our urban infrastructures are there risk-based hotspots, and where collectively can people work together better. I know it sounds very loose, but it is really the only thing that a lot of organizations aren't doing, is thinking a little bit broadly and understanding that everyone here today didn't just operate within the red line of a development. They had to travel across urban infrastructure, experiencing different flooding hotspots, experiencing different urban heat island effect in the summer, for example. And it's understanding a person's urban footprint is an indicator of the level of biological stress they'll be under. The higher that level, the higher the impact towards issues of absenteeism, burnout, health risks, and other long-term health disorders. So it's looking at the city as a whole, not just as a red line or the immediate development zone. And perhaps we need some new types of development zones around green development zones or urban greening development zones that landlords, developers, and others contribute to.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here from Claire Cullen. Could you talk a little bit more about a move towards a more circular way of operating?
Yes.
Who would like to go for it, Michael?
Well, that is an extremely complex question.
You've got 3 minutes between you.
Yeah, the circular economy is a kind of real kind of new ground that cities are really kind of trying to tackle. Projects that we're kind of looking at really are kind of ultimately philosophically looking at waste not existing in a city. But we don't have the systems currently to actually deal with that. So it's kind of like we're working on projected technologies, we're working on philosophical shifts, we're looking at kind of industries all working together in tandem to feed the kind of engine as such. So it's one of those things that I think to say is there one solution is not. I think it's starting to kind of ensure that industries that complement each other start to communicate and work with each other. It requires governance to be a driver in this. I don't think it's private sector led. It's got to be governance. It's got to start to drive the agenda and really start to re-educate people on how waste is managed. And I think it's something that over the next 10 to 20 years will become a more common thing. But currently at the moment, it's a kind of like a large unknown that some of the future cities that we're seeing are really trying to look at. But the existing cities that we operate in are so kind of underpinned by the fossil fuel economy and kind of old infrastructure that for it to be circular would require quite dramatic change currently. So I think it's, I can't really give you much of an answer. I feel like a politician giving an answer then, but yeah, it's complex. Josh, do you have anything to add?
Sadly, I've got nothing useful.
Well,
I'd just be talking for the sake of it. We don't need that.
well, I think that leaves me.
I think there's one question over there, actually.
Sorry.
Yeah, so it's Bill Price from WSP. We have mentioned TfL a tiny bit, but not really in the context of public transport. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on public transport, tubes, trains, and so on in the context of our topic.
Well, as I've experienced today, some tubes being closed because of flooding. I think that is a critical challenge that TfL faces. But the good thing about TfL is it also owns a lot of road infrastructure and a lot of sites. So there are opportunities to try and mitigate that. I do think the TfL on its own isn't going to solve this problem, and I think we have to kind of broaden the red line boundary, as Josh was saying, to start to look at those cities as kind of ecosystems. And to do that, we need to start to look at all of the open spaces, all of the street network working together. And TfL is a key kind of stakeholder in that discussion. But if we look at the problem with tube stations being flooded, it's not the tube station's fault, it's the infrastructure around it, and that's the kind of way we need to solve those problems. So I think if TfL wants to use tubes as a kind of key revenue source, it needs to unlock the upper plane to allow that. But then equally, by doing that, you are encouraging active travel, which is a really important thing. Cycling, outdoor travels, and walking and mobility from there is something that I think we're trying to encourage as well, because as part of a social health challenge as well. Josh?
Yeah, on the experience of taking public transport, it's actually an incredibly unhappy experience. So they found particulate matter levels on the London Underground, particularly at Hampstead High Street Station, Hampstead Station, at about 450 parts per million. Whilst the composition is very different to roadside, there is a high level of dust and sort of chemical runoff, and there is a need to clean that infrastructure. I think that's one conversation that needs to be had about actually how the materiality, the ventilation changes within public transport to ensure that the people using it are not adversely impacted by it. And this is no different, this is in Manhattan as well. But again, when we look at large landowners, people like TfL and the connected railway lines, there's a lot of urban landscape that they have at their mercy, and an ability as a single entity to have quite a broad impact from a climate resilient point of view. Everything from the railway lines themselves to the bridges that are connected, et cetera, et cetera. So as a consolidated landowner, there is a huge opportunity for them to provide more climate resilience from their infrastructure, but there is very much a need to clean the public transport infrastructure if we're going to maintain healthy people.
Well, that leaves me with just to say, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you some insights and some ideas to go away and do some further reading, and to say thank you to Michael and Josh for what I very much enjoyed their talks. So thank you.